You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
Wish you could become a morning person? You know the type, up before the sun, early morning runs, first one to the office with donuts and a smile. How do they do it? Easy. With the new Galaxy Watch 8, sleep tracking and personalized insights from Samsung Health help you improve so you can wake up to a whole new you. One who, dare I say it, skips the snooze? It's possible. Train your sleep with Galaxy Watch 8. Learn more at Samsung.com. Requires compatible Samsung Galaxy phone, Samsung Health app, and Samsung account.
No one should have to choose between their own safety and their pets. But nearly half of domestic abuse survivors delay leaving because they can't bring their pets with them. Purina is helping to create more pet-friendly domestic violence shelters through the Purple Leash Project, so survivors and their pets can escape and heal together. Visit Purina.com/purple to learn more.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another History of the Second World War interview. This time, I'm joined once again by Alan Allport, this time to talk about his new book, Advance Britannia, How the Second World War Was Won, 1942 to 1945, which is a sequel to his first book that he talked about on the podcast some time ago. The book is out November 6th, and it is available for pre-order right now. Or if you're listening to this in the future, go buy a copy, because it's probably on a shelf somewhere. Alan, thank you for joining us here again today.
Oh, you're very welcome.
So this is the second book in a two-book series. So sort of where does this volume kind of take up the story? What's kind of the state of the war on page one of this book?
So any history like this, obviously the division point is going to be a little bit arbitrary. The book, Britain Bay, the first volume of the series, ended after about 2 years of the war. So in other words, in September 1941. And with Advance Britannia, I have moved along the timeline a little bit in that it starts in December 1941 with the news arriving in London of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in the Pacific. And it is, to be perfectly honest, a little bit of an arbitrary decision about where to start there. But I do think that it is sort of intellectually justifiable in a couple of ways. And it makes a certain amount of sense because once you, after Pearl Harbor, the Allied coalition, which will ultimately go on to win the war and to make the peace, in other words, the British Empire and Commonwealth, the Soviet Union and the United States, has been assembled and will continue to dominate and make up the Allied alliance from this point onwards. Incidentally, just as a sidebar there, I will refer to Britain and the British from time to time during this discussion. What I really ought to say, of course, all the time is peoples of the United Kingdom, the British Empire, the Dominions, and the Greater Empire. However, it becomes slightly tiresome and redundant to keep saying that over and over again. So, wherever possible, I will. If I say the United Kingdom, I mean specifically the United Kingdom, and otherwise take British to mean that much larger British world beyond the UK. Anyway, yes. So the Allied coalition is assembled. The other thing that I think marks a transition is that the first 2 years of the war had been, as the title of my first book suggests, mostly about Britain at bay. In other words, trying to stave off defeat after the calamities of the opening months of the war. Now, Pearl Harbor is not the end of Allied defeat. Pearl Harbor itself, of course, is an Allied defeat. And paradoxically, the first 7 or 8 months of 1942 are in many ways the worst months for the Allies of the entire war. Britain in particular suffers a string of calamities, humiliating defeats in the Mediterranean theatre of operations, in North Africa, in Europe, it's northwestern Europe itself, with things like the fiasco of the Channel Dash in February 1942, and Dieppe a little bit later that year. And then, of course, most of all, in the Indian Ocean and what was then known as the Far East, with the successful Japanese invasions of Malaya, the capture of Singapore, Borneo, and Burma. But those victories, however spectacular at that particular moment, are very much the high watermark of the Axis advance. And definitely, once you get into late autumn and winter of 1942, the Allies are on the offensive and will, largely speaking, remain on the offensive for the rest of the war. One of the things which I think is different about the Second World War as opposed to the First World War is that the First World War appeared to be a genuine toss-up until surprisingly late in the conflict. As late as the spring of 1918, it still seemed perfectly possible that the Germans might actually win the war. The Second World War, I think, from the end of 1942, the beginning of 1943 onwards, it is increasingly obvious to everybody, including the Axis powers, about who is actually going to win. So the question isn't so much about what the outcome of the war will be, but when it will happen and how it will happen, because those do matter in terms of what the eventual shape of the peace and the post-war world will look like.
Speaking of how things will happen, sort of in 1942, Britain is now a member of this new grand alliance, this grand coalition. Is there a specific, coherent British strategy for how they think the war should be won at this time? Even though, over the last 3 years, there's going to be a lot of discussions between the three primary members about what that strategy is.
Yes, I think there is. In some ways, it goes all the way back to September 1939, and there had always been a general sense, even in the days of the Anglo-French alliance at the beginning of World War II, about how Germany might be defeated. Although that kind of theory of victory had to go on a hiatus for a while after June 1940, because for most of the period in Britain at Bay, British concern is not to achieve victory; it's simply to avoid defeat and to cling on. And it was often very difficult, I think, for somebody like Churchill to articulate how the war might actually be won. I think his main theory of victory in the second half of 1940 and for most of 1941 was just wait and see, and perhaps events will occur, perhaps something will turn up. And somewhat to everyone's surprise, that actually kind of worked out, in the sense that Hitler, for his own reasons, decided first of all to attack the Soviet Union in June 1941, which transformed the war in Europe. And then the Japanese, again, for their own reasons, decided to attack the Americans in December 1941. In particular, of course, Churchill had always hoped that the United States would ultimately become militarily involved in the war. For a long time, that had been more of a fantasy than a reality. And for many people, it still seemed very hard to understand how that was going to happen, even quite late into 1941. But in a sense, the Japanese had done the work for him and had brought the Americans in. So once you get into 1942, it is possible to now start to actually think about how the war is going to be won. And again, in some ways, what the British was certainly hearkening back to was the theory that they had introduced the war in 1939, which is that this is going to be a war of attrition. This is not going to be a war which is decided by spectacular, decisive victories on the battlefield. There was no sense of some kind of blitzkrieg strategy, the way that the Germans had used this in spring 1940. This is going to be a steady whittling down of Axis power. And that's going to be achieved because the Allied coalition ultimately has greater resources on which to draw. So the first priority in 1942, I think, was to hold the line, first of all, as much as possible, concede as little territory as possible, and to secure the vital sea lanes which linked this global maritime Allied alliance together. So the North Atlantic, communication lines between North America and the United Kingdom, the Indian Ocean, and the communication lines between Europe and India, and the Pacific line of communication, particularly between the west coast of the US and Australia. That's going to take some time to secure those lines. And in particular for the North Atlantic, that's not really going to be settled until the second half of 1943. But once that was done, it would be possible then to actually launch large-scale offensives. During this process, of course, the Allies would be mobilizing the vast industrial and manpower resources that they had available to them, and they would begin to press on the Axis powers on all sides, from the Mediterranean, from northwestern Europe, and then in the Pacific, from India and from Australia through the central Pacific. And there was never quite clear when this process was going to be finished. So when Churchill initially goes to see Roosevelt after Pearl Harbor, he's talking about maybe launching the final attacks at the end of 1943 or the beginning of 1944. Later on, it proves that that's an unrealistic timeline. We're going to have to look at the end of the war in 1944 instead, maybe the end of 1944. And later still, it turns out that the war is actually not going to get finished until 1945. So the estimates keep changing. The other thing I think to talk about here is that the British see the war very much as a division of labor between the different kind of allied powers. The British want to fight as much as possible a battle of machinery rather than a battle of mass armies. So their focus is on building up, first of all, of course, their navy in order to protect lines of communication, a strategic air force, of which there is a massive investment during the war in order to conduct strategic bombing against Germany, and a relatively small but a very highly mechanized army, land army, heavy on tank divisions, artillery, and again, using firepower in place of manpower. There are going to be huge masses that are going to be needed to fight the German army, but the British position is that's the job of the Russians and to a perhaps a slightly lesser extent the Americans as well. So what the British want to do is mobilize the labor force, but most of that labor force will actually be concentrated in factories on the industrial front, producing the machinery, the weapons, and the equipment that's going to be necessary to defeat the Germans.
You speak about kind of, in this 1942 period, all of these new allies sort of building up their own resources, getting ready for the attacks of the later years. One of those resources for the British Empire was the Indian Army. So during the first couple of years of the war, the Indian Army greatly, massively expanded. And sort of what role did it play during the last 3 years of the war? I feel like sometimes its contributions can get hidden by the fact that it gets included under a British Army kind of cloak, even though it's a lot of Indian forces underneath that, especially in the Pacific theater. So kind of what contributions did it make? But then also, what were relationships like at this point? I know they can sometimes be contentious between the leaders in London and the leaders and people in India during the 1930s, 1940s, and of course after the war. So where are we kind of at with India at this point?
So India provides the largest volunteer army in all history to the Allied cause in the Second World War, something like 2.5 million troops by the end of the war, which means that the Indian armies expanded about tenfold during the course of the war. And you're absolutely right. Its contributions do sort of tend to get a little bit disguised by the label of British forces, which is applied to, for instance, the fighting in North Africa or the fighting in Burma later on in the war. Most of those troops, especially in Burma, in fact, will actually be Indian forces. The focus for the Indian Army shifts a little bit in the second half of the war. It's still playing, as it has played since the beginning, an important role in the war in the Mediterranean. Indian divisions fight under Montgomery in Egypt and in the campaigns in Tunisia. They will contribute to the war in Italy later on. But because, of course, of the Japanese attack on the British colonies in South and Southeast Asia, the role of the Indian Army from 1942 onwards will be increasingly that of defending India itself and then also pushing back against the Japanese forces. And I think that the story of the Indian Army in the war is actually one of the most remarkable military success stories of the whole conflict. And it's an incredible transformation, both in the institution itself and in its fortunes. The thing about the Indian Army in 1939 is that it had been in many ways a lightly and poorly armed colonial gendarmerie. It was designed for basically internal security matters and border defense throughout the empire. It was poorly equipped. It was poorly trained. And these were actually not accidental. In some ways, these were features rather than bugs of the system, because the British didn't entirely trust the Indian Army. were still very conscious of what had happened in the 1850s and the so-called Indian Mutiny, or the First Indian Revolution. And so, for instance, as a matter of policy, Indian army units didn't have artillery. They didn't have tanks. There was certainly nothing of the form of an Indian Air Force or a really significant Indian Navy in 1941. Now, this changes as a result of necessities of war and the requirements to build a truly modern, mechanized, combined armed force. The Indian Army does very badly in the opening battles against the Japanese in Malaya and Burma. Again, as much because of the failures to conceive of how the force should be created, as much as of anything to do with the troops themselves. I think some credit for the transformation probably ought to go to people like Claude Auchinleck and Archibald Wavell. So these are two British commanders-in-chief of the Indian Army. Both of them had fought in North Africa and had been dismissed at various points by Churchill, who was not satisfied with the performance. But Auchinleck and Wavell, who are very sympathetic, I think, in lots of ways to the Indian view of the world, and have a good deal of affection for the Indian Army, and also see that if it's going to fight credibly, it needs to be given greater resources, greater understanding, greater respect. They helped to really transform the army, especially from 1943 onwards. So they introduced better training, better equipment, better material conditions for the troops, like food and welfare support for families of Indian soldiers. There's also, I think, a modest relaxation of some of the prejudice and inegalitarianism that had existed previously in the Indian Army. So the Indian Army of 1939 had been one which had almost entirely been indigenous Indian soldiers officered by white European officers. Now, white Europeans continue to be dominant in the officer corps throughout the war. However, there is some opportunity for the first time for Indians themselves to actually become officers. And that's obviously going to have a kind of transformational effect on the way that the army thinks and operates. So thanks to this and the efforts, of course, of ordinary soldiers, morale improves, the fighting qualities of the troops improve. And we actually get to see this for the first time really properly at the battles of Kohima and Impal at the beginning of 1944. The Japanese launch a major offensive against northeastern India, against Assam, and in horrendous conditions. The Indian Army not only halts the Japanese advance, but actually pushes the Japanese forces back. And then later, in the end of 1944, the beginning of 1945, you have Slim's offensive into central Burma. And again, it's an extraordinary achievement. It's the only battle, actually, really mobile battle that the British Empire fights in the Second World War and wins. In other words, a battle of the kind that the Germans had fought in France in spring 1940, mobile battle of maneuver. You mentioned something about the political implications of all of this, and they are very profound, because one of the big stories of the Second World War is the kind of the change in narrative, I guess, in India, in that the place of India within the British Empire had been a contentious one. Of course, in 1939, it had been contentious for many decades. But the possibility of actual independence for India, I think, moves in 1939 from a slightly marginal idea to an increasing inevitability by 1945. Indian soldiers, in particular, increasingly see their loyalty to the Raj as being a short-term contractual thing. And this is something that is very much going to expire once the Japanese are defeated. In other words, ordinary Indian soldiers, Indian officers, they're willing enough to fight for the British for their own reasons, while Japan is still a threat to India. But there is an increasingly important, tacit but increasingly important understanding that once the war is over, this Indian army is going to be loyal to a different kind of polity than the British Empire. And so It's interesting because the story of Indian independence is obviously often told from the point of view of the politicians and of the relationship between London and New Delhi on the one hand, and then figures like Gandhi or Nehru and so on, and the Indian Congress organization. But it's also a story about the emergence of a national institution like the Indian Army for the first time, a really powerful, self-confident, and consciously Indian institution, which is going to have its role in the victory is going to be a different one than anyone had thought in 1939.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because as you were talking about that, I'm imagining all of the other, like the British Empire as a whole. Like, it's not that much dissimilar from what had happened during the First World War, right? Where the creation of the Canadian Army or the Australian Army, or their contributions to the war, had been an important part of sort of pulling themselves away from the British Empire. They don't pull away completely during that interwar period, but it certainly starts that process. And it sounds like maybe something similar is happening during the Second World War with the Indian Army.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, there's something slightly paradoxical about both world wars in the sense that the war is both a kind of unifying effort in the sense that it is a kind of shared sacrifice, and this is, as you say, equally true with the quote unquote white dominions, as they were called. So Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. On the one hand, the war is something to look back on as something that has been a unitary effort. On the other hand, it's also, and this would be just as true for the Canadians, the Australians, the New Zealanders as well. The war is an experience which suggests to the dominions that their future is going to be a renegotiated relationship with London. I think that's particularly true of Australia, which Canada had also already to some extent made its own path before the Second World War. Australia's relationship, however, I think is profoundly changed by the defeat in Singapore in 1942 and the sense that the defense of Australia itself is not necessarily the highest priority of the United Kingdom. And so the Prime Minister, John Curtin, famously gives a broadcast in which he says that, henceforth, we will not necessarily look towards Britain for our, primary defense relationship, but we will look eastwards instead towards the United States. And, one can see in some ways the consequences of that catastrophe for the British Empire at the beginning of the 1942 as having huge consequences for the British Empire.
With new, gentler scented Clorox disinfecting wipes, clean finally smells as good as it feels. On everything from lamps to ceiling fans, even on your kid's toy shark. Oh, ouch. Clorox disinfecting wipes, now available in crisp lemon. Find it on Amazon. Clorox, clean feels good.
Okay, Chad. Today you're gonna drive the all-electric Toyota BZ.
But my electric vehicle phobia. I'm not ready, Dr. Ross.
I believe in you.
Oh my gosh. We're inside it.
Try to take deep breaths, okay?
The ventilated seats, they're touching me.
You can do this, Chad. Drive the car. How do you feel, Chad?
I feel cured. Woohoo! I'm doing it! I'm doing it!
The all-electric BZ. One drive can change your mind. Toyota. Let's go places.
So all of those kind of ramifications for the British Empire, sort of in the future after the war, thinking back to the war still, back in Europe, sort of in this 1944 period, of course, D-Day happens in June. But also you talk about in your book, sort of at that point, the British are reaching what is essentially their like maximum possible national contribution to the war, from a manpower perspective, from an industrial perspective. And yet for D-Day specifically, they are still able to contribute a pretty large percentage of overall forces. Like there's a lot of them there. even to the point where they take workers out of factories to have manpower to make those contributions. So, what's sort of driving those moves? They were, as you mentioned, they were looking to fight an industrial war. They were looking to fight a mechanized war, but yet here they're making the decision to reduce the production side of things to contribute to that manpower. So what are they doing here?
So I think the first thing to say about that is that, one of the things that I think all the powers discovered during the Second World War is that their ultimate fighting potential, the one variable that was always going to place a cap on what their fighting potential would be, was the size of the labor force that was available to each state. After all, money was not an object. You could always just print more money. You could even build more factories if necessary. But the one thing that you couldn't do is simply just grow new workers within a space of two or 3 years. So this was an absolute limitation upon what was achievable. And of course, the thing that characterizes the United Kingdom in particular, compared to the Soviet Union and the United States, is that its population was just a lot smaller. The USSR had something like 170 million people in 1944. The United States had 140 million. Britain has about 50 million, which means that there is a definite lower cap on what can be mobilized. And by mid-1943, that cap has been reached. In other words, there is no one left to call up in Britain. Every group which can in some way be mobilized for the war effort, be it in the armed forces or be it in industry, has already been called upon. And Britain, of course, is at this point is committed to fighting in Italy. It's committed to fighting in the Indian Ocean. It's committed to this enormously costly strategic bomber offensive. It's committed to the Battle of the Atlantic and all of the industrial support that's needed for this, and also for the imperial armies too. I think one thing that does need to be underlined is that most of the kit, most of the vehicles and equipment and so on for the British Empire, anything that was not provided by the United States was largely being provided by the United Kingdom. So it's having to have this enormous industrial output. Now, when you look at that situation under those circumstances, it perhaps would have actually made a good deal of sense for the British to take a bit of a backseat in the campaign in northwestern Europe, and to rely mostly on the United States to actually provide the ground forces to fight against the Germans. In some ways, the really indispensable role of Great Britain in the war had actually been achieved by this point. The one thing which nobody else could have done was to keep the war going in 1940 and 1941, when Britain was the only great power that was still fighting against the Germans. And then also for maybe a year or so in 1942, the beginning of 1943, to do the main bulk of the fighting certainly on the Western Front, while the United States was still in the process of mobilizing all of its resources. That role would have been absolutely crucial in victory, but it was done by 1944. It was over. The United States was itself now largely mobilized. So again, in theory, it would have made a good deal of sense for most of the troops who landed on D-Day to be American rather than to be British. But that was not politically possible, partly because Britain needed to make that, if you want to put it in the crudest terms, that kind of blood sacrifice on the beaches of Normandy. The British soldiers needed to be fighting and dying next to American soldiers, because that was the way in which that Churchill was going to be able to have a say in the way that the victory was ultimately going to be. The shape of the victory was going to be conceived. So how do you do it, though? How do you send such large forces when you're already absolutely maximized with your mobilization? So what you essentially do is you have to start making some choices here. And in particular, the British had to think about, when is the war going to end? Because this makes a big difference in the kind of choices we make. So, for instance, one of the things that the British could have done in 1943 and 44 is build a relatively small but sustainable army to send to France. One that only made up a few divisions, but one that could be maintained. that there would be sufficient reinforcements and so on to kind of keep it going. Or essentially they could go for broke, and they could close down a lot of the training and support facilities in the UK, all of the training organizations for the army, some of the supply elements of that were providing shells and munitions for the army and so on. And they could take all of those people and they could stick them in khaki and they could send them over as a much bigger force. The problem with that would be that if the war didn't end by the end of 1944, then that larger army was going to start falling apart because there were no reinforcements left. If that was the case, this was not a sustainable force, and the army would have to start cannibalizing itself in order to be able to keep fighting. So what the British were essentially decided to do in 1944 was to make a bet that the war was going to end by the end of that year. Montgomery does get to send a much larger force, British force, to Normandy, does fight throughout the campaign in Normandy. And I think it's important to understand something like Operation Market Garden in these terms. So when we get to September 1944 and the attempt to break through, cross the Rhine in southern Holland and to end the war in 1944, some of the reasoning for that was we have to try and get this thing over in the next few months. Ultimately, of course, that's not successful. The war is going to go on until 1945. The British make the wrong bet, as it turns out. And this is why by the time you get to after the Battle of the Bulge into early 1945, the British Army is in northwestern Europe is basically falling apart. It is having to dismantle divisions. It is having to desperately cannibalize forces in order to try and keep going. War is always about that. It's not so much that the question was who's going to win, but when are we going to win? Because that's going to make a big difference.
Yeah, it's always interesting when you analyze things like that and you can see nations kind of making mistakes. I would consider that a pretty major mistake, right? They made a bet, it failed, but it kind of gets covered up, right? It's still reasonably successful because of other things that happen around it. Whereas, if that happens at a different time, if the outcome is different, maybe that's one of the key talking points for about the Second World War is how the British made this huge, colossal blunder in 1944.
They got away with it to a certain extent because the war was the United States was there basically to pick up the slack, but it could have gone very, very badly indeed.
Yeah. You kind of mentioned one of the reasons for that decision was political in nature and kind of post-war looking. Throughout your book, a couple of times, you make the comparison when looking at Churchill's negotiations or discussions with Stalin, kind of from 1941 and onwards, and you compare them to Chamberlain's, Prime Minister Chamberlain's discussions or decisions before the war, specifically his conversations and discussions around appeasement with Hitler. When you make a comparison like that, I'm going to have to ask you for an overview of kind of why you were making that comparison between those two lines of conversations, and sort of what is the impact that those things have.
Well, one thing I'll say about that to begin with is that I'm certainly not the first person to notice that, because Churchill himself was somewhat uneasily aware of the potential comparison, the potential parallel that existed, and indeed he would try to preempt such comparisons, although I'm not sure entirely successfully. But the fact is that there were certain uneary similarities between the situation. Both, neither Chamberlain nor Churchill were particularly trustful, or at least they had very, very ambivalent relationships with the men that they were having to negotiate with. Chamberlain with Hitler in 1938, and then of course Churchill with Stalin from 1941 onwards. But they also recognized, I think correctly, that the nature of realpolitik was that they, whether they liked it or not, they were going to have to make somewhat unsavory deals with both of them. And I think that Chamberlain dies in the winter of 1940, but had he been alive to see what Churchill was doing in 1941, 1942, and so on, I think that perhaps he would have had a certain amount of sympathy with his successor in terms of the way in which they were also, they were having to accept negotiations with someone that they didn't necessarily like a great deal. But I do think that another thing that is similar here, though, is that both Chamberlain and Churchill, I think, had a great deal of they were very confident in their own ability to be able to shape these relationships through their own negotiating skills, through their own ability to kind of schmooze the dictators in one-to-one meetings. So Chamberlain had come back from Munich in 1938, convinced that he understood Hitler and that, whatever he thought about him personally, he thought that he was a guy he could basically work with. And I think that is largely the feeling that Churchill gets about Stalin in their meetings in 42, 43, and then in 44. However much he might personally dislike him, he thinks that Stalin likes Churchill. He thinks that there is a rapport there that he can work with. And again, I think some of Churchill's own colleagues sometimes kind of had slight side glances about this. And there is a moment where of kind of self-awareness, I think, with Churchill, where he actually is supposed to have said, poor Neville Chamberlain was wrong about Hitler, but I don't think I'm wrong about Stalin. Now, I think it could be argued that both Chamberlain and Churchill were somewhat naive about the impression that they had made on these dictators. I don't think Hitler personally liked Chamberlain very much, and I don't think that Stalin was all that impressed with Churchill either. In some ways, of course, one can sympathise again with the situation that they found themselves in. Churchill has certainly emerged much better from the comparison in the sense that Chamberlain is now regarded as being the epitome of everything that is disgraceful about a democratic politician trying to negotiate with dictators. Churchill got away with it a little bit more, but I think to some extent Churchill, of course, was lucky because I think there were important differences between Hitler and Stalin in the sense that Hitler was probably undeterrable, unappeasable, and actively wanted to fight a war against the Western powers, whereas Stalin, who was every bit as ruthless as Hitler, I think was happy to settle for security. At the end of the day, he was happy to settle for some kind of negotiated deal with the Western powers. So in that sense, Churchill sort of wins the comparison, but both men were, again, not necessarily had the most realistic view about what was going on, and also had to turn a blind eye to a good deal of cruelty that was taking place with the man that they were negotiating with.
The relationship, sort of enemy of my enemy is my friend relationship between Britain and the Soviet Union during the Second World War is kind of a key pillar of the conflict. But another relationship was the British Empire and the Americans. Now, I think that sort of the modern perception of that is that it was always a pretty coherent alliance. They were always pretty, in some way, unified in their goals and actions. But really, like, later in the war, there was some friction there. Like, the relationship there began to fray and change. And could you talk a little bit about that evolution? Sort of my interpretation from your book is that a lot of it revolved around Churchill and the British leaders kind of preparing for after the war, right? Looking at what their sort of position within the great power structures was going to be after the war. And I think you used the events in Greece in 1944 as a good illustration of this. So could you talk about that relationship a little bit?
Yeah. So what I'll preface my comments with is that I'm mostly going to talk about discord and disagreement, but I think that it's important to kind of frame this by saying that actually, the Anglo-American relationship in World War II is one of the most remarkable examples of military cooperation, I think, in any war. The ability to create an organization like the Combined Chiefs of Staff to coordinate a coherent kind of military strategy for the war, for all of the disagreements that occasionally existed on the two sides, and to sort of harmonize grand strategy in that way. It is a remarkable achievement, and it's one that I think has few parallels. Now, having said all that and getting that out of the way, there is no getting away from the fact that the relationship could be a difficult one. And Churchill's personal relationship with Roosevelt, I think, was quite a complicated one as well. Roosevelt could be frustratingly opaque. He is one of the hardest the leaders of World War II to sort of understand, in the sense of what he was really thinking. And people often found, when they talked with Roosevelt, that it would all be kind of bonhomie at the meeting itself, and Roosevelt would always kind of naturally agree with everything that they said and say, of course, we can have whatever you need, and so on. And then 4 weeks later or 6 weeks later, people would discover that actually he'd totally forgotten about this conversation and they had never acted on it or anything like that. And I think also, more profoundly perhaps, the long-term goals of the two leaders were different. The way that Churchill imagined the post-war world, or at least wanted the post-war world to be, was a recreation of the status quo antebellum. As much as possible, a return to a world in which certainly the British Empire would play a profoundly important central role in kind of stabilizing the world order. FDR has no sympathy for this view at all. FDR, I think, is much more radical and really wants to rebuild the world on New Deal lines, essentially expand the ideals of the New Deal to encompass the entire world. And a big part of that is going to be the dismantling of the European colonial structure in the world, which I think he regards as being, an anachronism, something that's absurd and unjust. The relationship in general between the UK and the United States had been one which had been created out of an emergency in 1940 and 1941. And there was always an element of a marriage of convenience to it, in the sense that the two powers clearly had important shared goals, in the sense of defeating the Axis forces. But as the defeat of the Axis becomes increasingly inevitable, so some of these fundamental differences were beginning to reassert themselves. The United States certainly wants to continue a relationship with the UK, but it wants to reestablish that relationship, not a relationship, not a partnership of equals, but a patron-client relationship. I think what you see, where you mentioned about Greece is certainly an example of the kind of growing political divisions that there are between the two sides as the war comes to an end. So we won't labor the people who are interested in knowing more about this. Of course, please read the book, in which I go into this in some more detail. But essentially, the British find themselves in a position at the end of 1944 where they are sending troops to Greece in order to prop up the monarchist, anti-communist government in Athens, which is out on the verge of a civil war. In fact, there will be a civil war in Greece shortly afterwards between communists and anti-communists. This does not go down well in the United States at this time. The British are accused of empire building in the Eastern Mediterranean. They are accused of being less interested in the war against the Axis than they are in establishing their own kind of colonial networks in the post-war world. And there are protests about this. There are, both at the level of the State Department, there are popular protests in Harvard about British imperialism and so on. All of this is somewhat ironic, because actually in 1947, President Truman would actually take up the role of supporting the anti-communist forces in Greece. So I don't think what was at stake was so much the issue itself. It was not really Greece that was the issue here. I think what was the real issue is that the British were attempting to conduct an independent foreign policy. And that was not something that the United States was particularly interested in seeing by 1944. So already we have overtones here of what's going to happen in Egypt, in Suez in 1956, is that the British are going to attempt to act alone without US support. And they're going to discover very quickly that that is not the world that they live in any longer.
So I guess, yet another similarity between the two world wars, the bloody Yanks coming in and destroying empires, or wanting to destroy empires.
That's right, yes. Yeah, although, of course, I mean, it becomes complicated after the Cold War begins, because Roosevelt had been all in favor of dismantling European empires. And then Harry Truman decides, well, let's not so fast, because these European empires can also be reliably anti-communist as well. But certainly the decisions about what's going to happen to the colonized world, increasingly, as far as the Americans are concerned, these are decisions that are going to be made in Washington. They're not going to be made in London or in Paris.
Hey, this is Bill Simmons from the Bill Simmons Podcast, here to tell you that Michelob Ultra, the official beer partner of the NBA, is bringing NBA fans closer than ever this season with chances to win great prizes, including courtside tickets. Enter now at michelobultra.com/courtside. Michelob Ultra courtside 25 to 26. No purchase necessary. Open to U.S. residents 21 plus. Begins on October 1st, 2025 and ends on June 30th, 2026. Multiple entry periods. See official rules at michelobultra.com/courtside for free entry deadlines, prizes, and details.
Building a portfolio with Fidelity Basket Portfolios is kind of like making a sandwich. It's as simple as picking your stocks and ETFs, sort of like your meats and other toppings, and managing it as one big, juicy investment. Now that's pretty good. Learn more at fidelity.com/baskets. Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC. Member NYSE SIPC.
Thinking about sort of after the war, the economic situation in Britain is rough for a while. Kind of one of the lasting legacies, I think, in Britain is the fact that that economic hardship right after the war. But you seem to make the case in the last chapter of your book that maybe things were not as disastrous as is sometimes portrayed, at least after like the first couple years in of the post-war period. So what was the economic status of Britain after fighting this 5.5 year conflict, where so much of Britain had been put into the war that was now over? Sort of what was the economics of Britain looking like in the 5 to 10 years after the war?
Well, I think to begin with, what we need to say is that the war does not end in the way that would have been preferable for the British. The best way that the war could have ended would have been for the war against Germany to be relatively quick, and the war against Japan to go on much, much longer. The reason for that, of course, from a purely self-interested perspective, was that the war against Germany was always, for the British, the primary conflict. It was the conflict in which they made the greatest investment in resources, and it was the conflict which was most difficult for Britain to fight and involved the greatest deal of sacrifice, both in terms of lives, but also in terms of national wealth and resources. So it would have been great for the British if the war against Germany had ended, ideally in 1943, or at least in 1944. Of course, it doesn't. It drags on all the way until May 1945. And we've already talked about some of the consequences of that. On the other hand, however, there was a lot to be said from a British point of view of the war against Japan going on until 1946 or 1947. Because the British were never making the same kind of contribution to that kind of war. If Tokyo had not surrendered until, say, the end of 1946 or 1947, that would have meant that the British would have been fighting this kind of semi-war, far away, one that they wouldn't have to make an enormous amount of effort to fight. But on the other hand, they would still be at war in alliance with the United States, and they would still be enjoying things like Lend-Lease, which was, by this point, increasingly important to just the British balance of payments and the basic structure of the British economy. So the worst of both worlds happens. Not only does the war against Germany drag on until May 1945, but the war against Japan then ends almost immediately afterwards, just 3 months later with the surrender in August 1945. So as soon as the war against Japan ends, Harry Truman, now president, informs Clement Attlee, who is now the British Prime Minister, that Lend-Lease will promptly end at the end of the month. Something which is, in the short term, is an absolute disaster for the British. Overall, Lend-Lease had been a wonderful thing for Britain. It had made it possible to fight the war. However, the transition from Lend-Lease to a more regular peacetime economy was always going to be difficult. And it has to be said that Truman maximizes the pain for Britain by making the transition so abrupt. And the first few years after the end of the war are very difficult years for the British. In some ways, paradoxically, even worse than the war years had been, in the sense that you're still essentially having to run a wartime economy without Lend-Lease. maybe also without the psychological rewards of feeling that you're actually, doing all of this in terms of the greater good. So the British still have to maintain big armies across the world in order to try and keep order in this sort of disintegrating, politically very unstable environment. They are having to maintain a rationing system. Rationing gets worse in the 1946 and 1947. British actually have lower food rations than they'd had during the war. There are some sort of random events which make things even worse. So the winter of 1946-47 is particularly awful, causing shortages of coal, huge kind of transportation difficulties, which makes it very difficult to get food and other supplies around the country and so on. You can look at the very shabby state of Britain in 1946 and 1947 and understand why people would kind of look around and think, what exactly did we fight this war for? In what way could we be realistically described as having won this war, given this kind of rather miserable state that we find ourselves in? And when you think about that, and of course the empire is also in the process of collapsing at the same time as well. When you look at all of this, you can sort of think back to what Neville Chamberlain had prophesied back in 1937, 1938, where he had said, if we fight another global war, another global world war, even if we are on the winning side, we will emerge from this war a much diminished nation. We will emerge from this with our power, with our wealth greatly diminished. In other words, there is no way that we can actually come out of such a conflict and not be defeated in some way or other. From the perspective of the late 1940s, one could understand why that would seem to have a kind of ominous echo to it. On the other hand, however, Chamberlain was right, I suppose, in the sense that he saw a future world, another world war, as meaning a permanent transfer of power from across the Atlantic, from London to Washington, D.C. He was right in the sense that another world war would probably accelerate Britain's relative decline vis-a-vis other great powers. What I don't think he didn't see, what he failed to predict, was the way in which another world war would completely transform the global conditions for permanent growth in the world. The interwar years had been very difficult ones internationally. Trade had been depressed. It had been a very poor conditions for economic growth. With the creation of new institutions after the war, the Bretton Woods settlement, creations of things like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, the lowering of tariff barriers, the World Bank and things like this, and of course the need to reconstruct after such a devastating experience. What you get is 25 years of extraordinary economic growth and economic prosperity. The material circumstances of most of the world are transformed in those years, in the 1950s, the 1960s. In many ways, they are simply the best quarter century that any human beings have ever lived through, in terms of the way in which progress and prosperity seem to be advancing. And so it seems to me rather strange to look in, say the Britain of the 1960s or even into the early 1970s, when, yes, there were still plenty of problems and so on. Britain had declined in some way compared to countries like Germany and Japan. But that relative decline long preceded the Second World War anyway. That relative decline had been going on since at least the end of the 19th century, and it had nothing ultimately to do with the Second World War. It would have continued apace no matter what. Yes, the empire was vanishing by the 60s and 70s, but that's a good thing. It's a good thing ultimately that an involuntary empire eventually is dismantled. How could a liberal state, or a state with liberal pretensions, ever continue such a thing? And actually, the most remarkable thing about the end of the British Empire is, for the British themselves, how relatively peaceful it was. It could be very violent out in the empire itself, but for the British, the consequences of the end of empire were relatively mild. Certainly, Britain didn't go through anything like the sort of trauma that existed in France through the war in Algeria and so on. So if you look at the perspective of a post-war Britain enjoying a kind of quality of life that they could never have imagined in the 1920s or the 30s, it seems very strange to say that somehow the war hadn't been worth it, or that Britain had, as this phrase sometimes goes, won the war but lost the peace. If that was losing the peace, then I think it was a loss that most people could take very, very happily. So, I probably have a somewhat acerbic, cynical temperament, and that often I think comes through in the book. But what I do hope, I think, in that final chapter is that I say, absolutely, the Second World War was worth fighting, not only because, of course, that the powers that were defeated deserved to be defeated, and the world was far better off without them, but also because the Second World War, in all of its messy, awkward way, did create a world which was better for everybody in the end.
So I do have one sort of final question here that I often ask historians who have a series of books that leads them to the end of the war. You've spent, I'm sure, a tremendous number of hours researching and writing these books. Coming away from the experience of writing these two books before you move on to other projects. So what do you think maybe something your mind has changed about, something that you've learned along the way, something that maybe you didn't know or have changed your mind about, I guess, over the course of this project? Is there something that kind of sticks out to you?
Well, that's a good question. I think there's a few things. I mean, one of the things I think is the book, writing these books, and it's taken me about 10 years, has forced me to reflect upon is how much did the war actually change Britain? I mean, in what way was Britain a different kind of country that emerged from the war? I've talked a little bit already about the way in which, in many ways, the war, although it produced, tremendous suffering at the time, and there was a good deal of pain in the immediate aftermath, ultimately Britain was a much happier, healthier, wealthier country afterwards. I think culturally speaking, and maybe in terms of politics as well, I actually think the war had less effect on Britain than might have been expected. And I think maybe that might be surprising, because the war is often seen as being this watershed moment, certainly in British political history, with the election of the Labour government in 1945 and the creation of the welfare state and the National Health Service and other kinds of institutions after the war. I sort of came into the project very much with that in mind, that the war was going to involve an enormous kind of change in the way that people thought about the world. And I'm less convinced about that at the end of this. I think that, most historical problems are often about this question about change versus continuity. In other words, the basic issue is, did things change a lot, or did things actually stay the same? And I am, having written these two books, I am leaning more now to the way in which, to emphasize the continuities in British life. Britain, yes, it elected a socialist government in 1945. I think it still remained a very conservative country in lots of different ways. I think one of the key differences between Britain and the other nation states of Europe is that, almost without exception, Britain was the only one that fought the war but never experienced occupation or defeat. And I think that made a rather profoundly different kind of experience. The French, the Germans, the Italians, all of these peoples, for one reason or another, experienced defeat, occupation, and they had to reconceive to some extent their national way of life, their national thinking as a result of this. The British were never exposed to that in the same way, which means that, to a large extent, most of the basic institutions that ran British life were legitimized by the war, were reinforced by the war. You think about things like the monarchy. You think about things like the basic social structure in lots of ways, institutions like the BBC, institutions that dominate national life. They had all been validated by victory. And although I this is a conversation for another time and probably for another historian, I do think that this would have long-term consequences in terms of Britain's always ambivalent attitude towards continental Europe. The British are obviously drawn increasingly into a relationship with Europe in the post-war years, which will culminate in 1973 with the Britain's entry into the European Economic Community, as it was known by that time. What we thought at the time was a permanent transition, although that's not turned out to be the case. But for the British, the Europeans were always the peoples that had fallen short in some ways because of the fact that they had not they had been defeated by the Germans and the British had not. Now, I think a lot of the reasons for that Britain was not defeated were contingent and had nothing to do with national character or innate superiority or anything like that.
There's a bit of water there. The bit of water there that was very important.
A bit of water there had something to do with it, exactly right. But it is difficult not to come away from that kind of experience and think that the reason that we didn't lose, the reason we were never defeated, is because we are us and they are them. And I think that way of thinking, for better or worse, and it's probably been mostly for worse, has tended to dominate kind of British life ever since 1945.
They were not defeated. Therefore, their not to defeat was completely skill-based and had nothing to do with luck.
Exactly, yes.
Thank you so much for coming to talk to us again about your new book, Advanced Britannia. Although I will say there are far fewer Tolkien references in this one, which I did notice.
I do squeeze a few in, I think.
You do. There are a few.
Yes,
far fewer. I noticed.
I apologize.
Thank you, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much.